He kissed me like he meant it, and then he left town like he didn't. That's the part nobody warns you about, that the worst silence isn't the one before a kiss, it's the one after. For 18 years, Sawyer Reyes and I had a joke between us, one so old neither of us remembered who started it. Practice, for when it counts. We said it the way other people say bless you, automatic, harmless, a reflex. We'd said it 100 times and it had never once been real. Until the night it rained so hard the power went out on Marlowe Street, and he showed up at my door with his knuckles bleeding from a wall he'd hit, and he didn't say the joke at all. He just kissed me. No warning. No smile after. Like it cost him something to do it and something worse not to. Then he was gone before I could ask him what it meant. For 3 weeks I told myself it didn't happen. Then I found out he'd applied for a job 400 miles away, and I understood that whatever that kiss was, it wasn't nothing, it was the start of him disappearing. But what happened next changed my life forever. The tape deck still worked, which was more than I could say for most things that had belonged to my brother. I kept it on the shelf above my mixing desk, an old chrome and black Sony that Theo had carried everywhere the last summer he was alive, and every few months I'd feed it a cassette just to hear it click and hiss before the music started. It was a habit Sawyer teased me about, "You're 26, Eli," by a phone, but he never once told me to stop. That was the thing about Sawyer Reyes. He noticed exactly how far to push and exactly where to stop. We'd grown up 2 doors apart in Port Holloway, a town small enough that everyone knew whose porch light stayed on too late and whose parents fought loud enough to hear from the street. Sawyer's father built things, additions, docks, the kind of steady construction work that kept Reyes' son in business for 3 generations, and it was assumed, the way gravity is assumed, that Sawyer would take the company when the time came. He'd gone to school for architecture instead, which his father allowed the way you allow a child a hobby, confident it would pass. It hadn't passed. It had just gone quiet. I was in my studio, a converted boathouse that smelled permanently of salt and solder, the afternoon he texted asking if he could come by. He never asked. He just came. So I knew before I saw his face that something was wrong. He looked like he hadn't slept. His knuckles, when he shoved his hands in his pockets, were scraped pink. "Family dinner," he said, by way of explanation, dropping onto my ratty studio couch. "Dad's expanding the Ridgeline contract. Wants me to run the crew personally. Full-time. Starting in September. And you told him no." I told him I'd think about it. He rubbed his jaw. "Which is the same thing as yes, eventually, and we both know it." I didn't say anything right away. I never knew what to say to Sawyer when his father came up, because the truth, that I thought his father was slowly sanding him down into someone smaller, wasn't mine to say out loud. So instead I handed him the mug of coffee I'd made without thinking, the one with too much sugar the way he liked it, and sat down across from him. "You could just tell him about the lighthouse thing," I said. "The Historical Society grant. You've been talking about it for a year." Something shifted behind his eyes, quick, careful, gone before I could name it. "It's not a real thing yet. It's real enough that you drove out there at 6 a.m. last Tuesday. You're keeping track of my mornings now. I live 2 doors down, Sawyer. I see your truck." He almost smiled. Almost. Instead he looked past me, out the boathouse window toward the water, toward the old lighthouse standing white and peeling at the end of the point, and something in his jaw went tight in a way I recognized but couldn't place. "Practice," he said suddenly, quietly, like he was testing the word. I laughed, because that's what you do when someone says the old joke, 18 years of practice, for when it counts, a bit we'd worn smooth as a stone in our pockets. Except he wasn't laughing. He was looking at me with an expression I'd never once seen on him in 18 years, something raw and unguarded, like a door left open in a storm. "Sawyer." "Forget it," he said, standing too fast, coffee sloshing. "I should go." He was gone before I could ask him what had just happened. I sat alone in the boathouse a long time after, the tape deck clicking quietly through Theo's old mixtape, wondering why my chest felt like it did the night I got the phone call about the boat 6 years ago, that same lurch, that same something is about to change and I can't stop it. I didn't know yet how right I was. He didn't come by for 4 days after that, which was its own kind of unprecedented. Sawyer and I had a rhythm, coffee some mornings, dinner most Thursdays, the two of us on my dock most nights arguing about nothing in particular until the mosquitoes won. 4 days of silence from him felt like 4 days of a clock stopped mid-tick. I saw him on the 5th day, from a distance, standing on the rocks below the lighthouse with a woman I didn't recognize, clipboard, hard hat, a laminated badge on a lanyard. Historical Society, probably. He was gesturing at the tower, animated in a way I rarely saw him, and for a second I let myself just watch him from the road, the wind pulling his hair sideways, his hands moving like he was building something invisible in the air between him and the lighthouse. I didn't go down. I don't know why. Something about the moment felt like it belonged only to him. That night, my father, who ran the marina office and knew everything before it happened, mentioned over dinner that Ted Reyes had been in a foul mood all week, muttering about his son throwing away a real future for some antique. I asked what he meant. My father shrugged and said something about a job posting, a preservation architecture firm, up in Portland. I told myself it was nothing. Architects look at job postings. It doesn't mean anything. I believed that for exactly one more day. The rain came in fast that Thursday, the kind of coastal storm that knocks the power out before you've even noticed the sky going dark. I was lighting candles in the boathouse, cursing at a blown fuse, when I heard the knock, 3 short, 1 long, the pattern we'd used since we were 12 and sneaking out. Sawyer stood in my doorway soaked through, his knuckles split and raw like he'd hit something solid, his eyes red in a way that had nothing to do with the rain. "What happened to your hand?" "Doesn't matter. Sawyer." I told my father I wasn't taking the Ridgeline contract. His voice was flat, stripped of anything soft. He said some things. I said some things back. I might have put my fist through the tailgate of his truck, which, for the record, hurt a lot more than it looked like it would in the moment. I pulled him inside before he could say no, found a towel, pressed it into his hands without really thinking, the way you do things for people you've loved so long the gestures happen before the thought does. He sat on my couch dripping, staring at nothing, and I sat beside him because I didn't know what else to do with the size of whatever was happening in the room. "Talk to me," I said. "I can't." "Since when can't you talk to me?" He turned then, and the candlelight caught his face at an angle I'd never seen it from before, not the boy I'd grown up with, not the friend who teased me about cassette tapes, but someone standing at the very edge of something he'd been circling for a long time. "Since it stopped being about my father," he said, "and started being about you." I didn't have time to ask what that meant. He kissed me. "Not the joke. Not practice, for when it counts," said with a grin and a shove to the shoulder. His hand came up to my jaw, careful, like he was afraid I'd disappear if he moved too fast, and he kissed me like it was the last honest thing he had left in him. I don't know how long it lasted. Long enough that the candle guttered. Long enough that when he pulled back, his forehead against mine, his breath uneven, I understood that something in my life had just permanently rearranged itself. "Sawyer. I have to go," he whispered, and before I could say another word, he was out the door into the rain, and I was standing alone in a dark boathouse with my hand still raised toward the space where his face had been. He didn't answer his phone for 2 days. I told myself he needed space, a fight with his father, a kiss that clearly terrified him, that was a lot for one Thursday night. I gave him room the way you give an animal room when it's hurt and cornered. But by the 3rd day, when his truck hadn't moved from his driveway and his mother told me, awkwardly, that he was staying with a friend in the city for a bit, work stuff, the quiet stopped feeling like space and started feeling like avoidance. I went to the marina office instead, because I needed to do something with my hands, and found my father sorting mail behind the counter. You look like a man who got some bad news, he said, not looking up. I don't know what I got. He glanced at me then, the particular look he'd been giving me since Theo died, careful, like he was checking for cracks. Reyes boy? I hadn't told him anything. I never had to, with my father. Something happened. Something good or something that scared you? Both, I think. Maybe that's the same thing. He set the mail down. Your brother used to say the scariest thing in the world wasn't losing someone. It was letting them close enough that you could. I hadn't heard that in years, one of Theo's lines, tossed off the way he tossed off most of his wisdom, half joke, half true. I didn't know what to do with it except carry it out to the truck with me and drive to the one place I thought Sawyer might actually be honest with me, if he was anywhere at all. The lighthouse. He was there, exactly like I'd hoped, sitting on the same rocks I'd seen him on days before, a set of blueprints rolled beside him weighted down with a stone. He didn't look surprised when I climbed down to him. He looked like a man who'd been waiting to be found and dreading it in equal measure. You've been avoiding me, I said. Yes. At least he didn't lie. Why? He picked at the edge of the blueprint roll instead of answering, and for a second I thought he'd go quiet the way he had in the boathouse, closing the door on whatever this was. Then he said, so low I almost lost it to the wind. Because I've been in love with you for 6 years, Eli, and I finally said it with my mouth instead of my mouth staying shut like it should have, and now I don't know how to be your friend and not the other thing, and I don't know how to be the other thing and risk losing you as my friend, so I did the only thing that made sense, which was leave before you could tell me which one I get to keep. I sat down hard on the rock beside him. 6 years. That was almost exactly. Since Theo, I said quietly. He flinched like I'd hit him. Yeah. Since the accident. I watched you fall apart, he said, voice cracking, and I was so busy being furious that the world had done that to you that I didn't notice I'd fallen in love with the person putting himself back together in front of me. And I never said anything, because you were grieving, and then because too much time had passed, and then because I told myself the joke was safer than the truth. The wind pulled at the blueprints. I looked down and saw, for the first time, what they actually were, not a rough concept sketch, but full architectural drawings. Lighthouse Tower. Keeper's Cottage. A small studio addition on the seaward side, windows facing the water. What's the studio for? I asked, throat tight. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone somewhere very far away. It doesn't matter now. I applied for a job in Portland. Preservation architecture firm. I'm supposed to hear back this week. The world tilted slightly. You're leaving. I think I have to. I didn't sleep that night, and I don't think he did either, because at 2 a.m. I saw his kitchen light still on from my bedroom window, the way I'd seen it 100 nights before without ever wondering what kept him up. Now I wondered about everything. 6 years of a joke that had never once been a joke to him. 6 years of him standing 2 doors down, watching me relearn how to breathe after the accident, and never once telling me that somewhere in the wreckage of my grief, he'd fallen in love with what was left of me. I turned that over so many times I lost count, the way you turn over a stone looking for the crack in it. I went to see Marisol the next morning, mostly because I needed to say the words out loud to someone who wouldn't flinch. She ran the bakery on Cutter Street and had known both of us since we were kids stealing day-old muffins off her cooling racks. He kissed me, I said, before she'd even finished pouring my coffee. And then he told me he's been in love with me for 6 years. And then he told me he's leaving. She didn't look surprised, which somehow made it worse. Eli, sweetheart, I've been waiting for you two to catch up to the rest of us since you were 19. You knew? Everyone knew. Except, apparently, the 2 of you. She slid the coffee across the counter. Why do you think he's leaving? Job in Portland. Some preservation firm. And why do you think a boy who spent a year fighting his own father for the right to restore that lighthouse would suddenly want to leave the one town that has a lighthouse in it? I opened my mouth and found I had no answer. Marisol raised an eyebrow, the way she used to when we were teenagers trying to talk our way into a second pastry, and let the silence do the rest of the work. I drove to the lighthouse that afternoon and didn't find him. I found the Historical Society woman instead, the one with the clipboard, packing equipment into her car. "You're Eli," she said, before I introduced myself. "Sawyer talks about you." Talked. I don't know what tense to use, honestly, given how the last week's gone. What happened with the grant? She hesitated, the particular hesitation of someone deciding whether a thing is theirs to tell. The society approved his restoration proposal 2 weeks ago. Full funding. He's supposed to start in the fall. She frowned. He came by yesterday and asked how binding the agreement was. Whether he could still back out. Something cold moved through me. Why would he back out of something he fought a year for? He didn't say. But he did ask me something strange. She zipped her bag shut. He asked if the keeper's cottage renovation could be scaled back. Made smaller. 1 bedroom instead of 2. She looked at me carefully. I got the sense he wasn't building it for himself anymore. I stood on those rocks a long time after she left, staring up at a lighthouse that had stood over this town longer than any of us had been alive, and understood, all at once, the shape of what he hadn't told me. I found him that evening at his father's yard, of all places, standing amid stacked lumber with his hands in his pockets like a man waiting for a verdict. "You applied to leave a project you fought a year to get," I said, "and you shrank the cottage you were designing before you even knew if I'd want to be in it." He went very still. "You talked to Priya." "I talked to a lot of people today. Marisol says everyone in this town has known you loved me since I was 19. Your Historical Society contact thinks you're not building that cottage for yourself anymore. And you," my voice cracked, and I let it. "You kissed me like I mattered and then tried to put 400 miles between us before I could tell you that you do." "Because I panicked," he said, raw. "Because I finally told you the truth and instead of feeling relief I felt like I'd handed you a weapon. What if you didn't want this? What if you only wanted your best friend back, and I'd ruined that by wanting more? Leaving felt safer than watching your face while you figured out how to let me down. So instead of asking me, you just left." "I was going to ask. I swear I was going to ask you first." He rubbed his eyes. "And then I remembered." "Remembered what?" He looked at me like the words cost him blood. "The water, Eli. The lighthouse sits right over the channel where Theo," he stopped himself, but I already knew where the sentence went. "I've been building a life around that lighthouse for a year, and somewhere in there I realized I might be asking you to build a future in the one place that probably hurts you the most to look at. I didn't know how to ask you to move toward the water when I watched it take your brother from you." The wind off the point went very quiet in my chest. I hadn't told him, hadn't told anyone, not really, that in the last year the ache near that water had started to soften into something closer to peace. That I'd started going down to the rocks alone sometimes, not to grieve, but because it was the only place in town that felt like it understood how big a thing loss was. I'd assumed my silence about it meant I was still drowning. He'd assumed the same. "You should have asked me," I said quietly. "Instead of deciding for both of us what I could survive." "I know. I'm not made of glass, Sawyer. I buried my brother. I know exactly what it costs to lose someone, and I chose to keep loving people anyway, my father, this town, you. I don't need you to protect me from a view. I need you to trust me enough to ask." His jaw worked, and for the first time since the kiss, I saw something in him unclench. "I'm asking now, then. Late, and badly, but I'm asking. Is there a version of this where you want me to stay?" I closed the distance between us in the lumber yard, in the fading light, in front of a stack of 2x4s that had absolutely no business witnessing the most important conversation of my life. "There's a version," I said, "where you stop deciding my heart is too fragile to choose you. That's the only version I want." He didn't kiss me again right away, which surprised me. Instead he took my hand, carefully, like he was still learning the shape of being allowed to, and said, "There's something else you should know before you decide anything." "More secrets?" "One more. Then I'm done." He led me to his truck, and we drove without much talking to the lighthouse, the sun dropping orange behind us, until we were standing again on those familiar rocks. "The Historical Society didn't just approve a restoration," he said. "They approved my proposal. Not my father's firm's. Mine. I spent 8 months building it in secret because I knew if he found out before it was official, he'd find a way to kill it, underbid me for the contract himself, out of spite, or guilt me out of it at some family dinner. I let everyone believe I was still deciding about Ridgeline because the truth was I'd already decided, and I was terrified of what it would cost me to say it out loud." "What did it cost you?" "My father hasn't spoken to me since Thursday. Not one word." His voice wavered, just slightly. "I grew up believing his approval was the ground I stood on. Turns out the ground was never as solid as I thought. I built something real instead, and it held anyway. I thought about my own father, about the way he'd let me sit quiet at dinner tables for months after Theo died and never once demanded I explain my grief on his schedule. I thought about how differently two fathers could hold their sons. I'm proud of you," I said, and meant it more than I'd meant almost anything. "Even though it means I might actually stay? Especially because of that." He exhaled, long and shaking, like something he'd been carrying since he was 20 had finally set itself down. "There's a version of the cottage with 2 bedrooms, he said. "I only ever drew the 1-bedroom version this week, when I thought I was leaving. Before that, 4 months, it was always 2. One for me. One I never let myself name." "Who was the 2nd bedroom for?" He looked at me the way he had in the candlelight, the same unguarded rawness, except this time he didn't run. "You. It was always going to be you, Eli. I just didn't have the courage to say it until the joke ran out of places to hide." I stepped closer, my hand finding his jaw the way his had found mine 4 nights ago, and this time I was the one who closed the distance. The kiss wasn't a joke this time either. It wasn't panic, or a door slammed open by grief and rage. It was slow, and certain, and it tasted like 6 years of almost. When we broke apart, he pressed his forehead to mine, breathing unsteady. "Was that practice?" "No," I said. "That one counted." Word travels fast in a town the size of Port Holloway, and by the following morning half of Cutter Street knew Sawyer Reyes had turned down his father's business to restore the lighthouse, and knew, too, in the particular way small towns know things without anyone confirming them, that he and I had become something neither of us had a simple word for yet. His father wasn't among the well-wishers. I found out from Sawyer, 3 days later, sitting on my dock with his knees drawn up, more unguarded than I'd seen him since he was a teenager crying over a college rejection letter he hadn't told anyone about but me. "He came by the site today," Sawyer said. "First time since the fight." "And?" He looked at the blueprints for a long time. "Didn't say anything about the lighthouse. Didn't say anything about the firm, or Ridgeline, or any of it." Sawyer's throat moved. "He asked if you made me happy." My chest tightened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were the first thing in my life I'd ever chosen without being afraid of what it would cost me. And that if that wasn't enough for him, I understood, but it wasn't going to change my answer." "What did he say to that?" "Nothing. He just nodded and left." Sawyer looked out at the water, the lighthouse a pale shape at the end of the point, catching the last of the sun. "I don't know if that means he's coming around or if it means he's done. I've spent so long needing him to be proud of me that I don't actually know how to want something and not have his approval attached to it. I thought of Theo again, how he used to say that the bravest thing anyone ever does is want something out loud, in front of people who might say no. Maybe this is the first time in your life you get to find out, I said. Whether the thing you built is enough on its own, without anyone's permission. He was quiet a long moment, then reached over and laced his fingers through mine, careful the way he'd been careful with everything since that rainy Thursday. It's a strange kind of freedom, he said. Terrifying. But strange. Good things usually are, at first. We sat there until the sun went down completely, until the old lighthouse's restored beam, the historical society had gotten the light itself working again just that week, ahead of the real construction, swept its first slow arc across the water in longer than either of us could remember. I watched it catch the waves, gold and searching, and for the first time in 6 years, I didn't think of that light and see the water that took my brother. I saw, instead, the shape of something being found instead of lost. His father came to the lighthouse a week later, on a morning when Sawyer wasn't there, just me, checking a delivery of lumber that had come to the wrong address, and Ted Reyes standing at the base of the tower with his hands in his jacket pockets and an expression I couldn't read. Eli, he said, which surprised me. He'd called me the Marchetti boy for as long as I could remember. Mr. Reyes. He looked up at the tower a long time before he spoke again. I built half the docks in this town. Renovated the Cutter Street storefronts. Put an addition on nearly every house on Marlowe. 31 years of work, and none of it made anyone look the way my son looks when he talks about this lighthouse. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and let him keep going. I wanted him to want what I built. It never occurred to me he might want to build something of his own instead, and that it might be good. Better than good. He cleared his throat, gruff, unpracticed at whatever this was. I was hard on him about you, too. Not because of who you are. Because I didn't understand yet that a person can choose a life that isn't the one you handed them and still turn out all right. Better than all right. He loves this place, I said carefully. He always has. He just never had permission to say so. I know. Ted Reyes looked at me then, really looked, the way a man looks at someone he's deciding whether to trust. Does he love you the same way? I think he's loved me longer than he's loved the lighthouse, I said. He just said it out loud more recently. Something moved through the older man's face, not quite a smile, but close to one, the ghost of pride finding a shape it hadn't expected to take. Tell him I stopped by, he said. Tell him the North Dock renovation I've got going next month, I could use an architect who actually knows what he's doing with a waterline. If he's interested. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to everything Sawyer needed from him. But it was a door left open instead of slammed shut, and I understood, watching him walk back to his truck, that some kinds of love arrive slowly, in installments, the way light reaches you a long time after it's left its source. I told Sawyer that night, on the dock, the lighthouse beam sweeping steady behind him. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he put his head down against my shoulder, and I felt him breathe out something that had been sitting in his chest for the better part of 20 years. That's the most he said to me, about me, since I was 19, he said quietly. It's a start. Yeah. He lifted his head, eyes bright in the dark. It's a start. Construction on the lighthouse began in earnest that autumn, and I found myself down there most afternoons anyway, not because anyone needed me, but because I liked watching Sawyer become the fullest version of himself I'd ever seen, sleeves rolled, blueprints spread over sawhorses, calling out measurements to a crew that had started calling him boss without anyone deciding it officially. One afternoon he found me sitting on the same rocks where he'd once told me he was leaving, and sat down beside me with 2 coffees, one too sweet, the way I liked it. I got the final go-ahead on the cottage today, he said. 2 bedrooms. I know. You showed me the plans 3 times this week. I like showing you the plans. He nudged my shoulder. You could move in, you know. When it's done. If you wanted to. My chest did something complicated and warm. Sawyer Reyes, are you asking me to move in with you? I'm asking you to consider it. I'm also aware I have terrible timing for big questions, historically, so feel free to take your time. I laughed, really laughed, the kind that had gotten rarer in the years since Theo died and was only now, slowly, coming back into regular rotation. I don't need time. I've had 6 years of practice, remember? That's not fair, using my own line against me. It's extremely fair. You started it. I leaned into him, watching the tower rise pale and patched with new white paint against the sky. Yes, Sawyer. I want to move in. I want the 2 bedrooms and the studio with the seaward windows and the ridiculous amount of time you're going to spend fussing over whether the trim is period accurate. It matters, he said, mock wounded. Historical integrity matters. I know it does. That's part of why I love you. The words left me easily, more easily than I'd expected them to. 6 years and a lifetime of joking making room, finally, for the plain truth of it. He went still beside me, coffee forgotten in his hand, and looked at me like I'd handed him something he hadn't let himself hope for. Say it again, he said. I love you. Not the joke version. There is no joke version left, Sawyer. This is just what's true. He kissed me then, salt air and sweet coffee and 6 years of almost finally arriving somewhere solid, and behind us the lighthouse stood patient and steady, the way it had stood through every storm this town had ever weathered, the way I was starting to believe we might, too. The lighthouse relit officially on the first Saturday of December. The whole town gathered on the point with mugs of cider and blankets against the cold, the Historical Society woman giving a short speech about heritage and preservation that half the crowd only half listened to, more interested in watching the beam sweep for the first time at full strength. Ted Reyes stood near the back, not quite at the center of things but not absent either, which for him was its own kind of arrival. He caught my eye once across the crowd and gave a short nod, the kind 2 people give each other when there's history between them that doesn't need more words yet. Sawyer found my hand as the light came up, gold and slow, sweeping out over black water that had once taken something irreplaceable from me and had, somehow, in the years since, become the place where I found him instead. Nervous? He asked, low, just for me. About the lighthouse or about moving in next week? Either. Both. I thought about Theo, the way I still did most days, less like a wound now and more like a room in a house I still lived in, a room I visited, sat in, left the light on for. I thought about the old cassette tape deck, which I planned to keep on a shelf in our new studio, still clicking through his mixtapes on quiet evenings. I thought about 6 years of a joke that had, in the end, told the truth better than either of us knew how to. Not nervous, I said. For the first time in a long time, not really nervous at all. The beam swept over us again, warm against the December dark, and Sawyer pulled me close, his mouth at my temple. Practice? He murmured, the old word between us, worn soft as a stone. No, I said, turning into him, into the light, into the life we'd built out of what almost didn't happen. This is the real thing. It always was. We just finally stopped pretending it wasn't. Behind us, the lighthouse turned steady toward the water, keeping its old promise to anyone still finding their way home. And for the first time since I could remember, I understood that some things you wait years to say aren't wasted in the waiting, they're only being built, quietly, into something strong enough to finally hold.